Welcome back to the Attack Flow online training. This is section 3, building an attack flow. In this section, we'll take everything that we've learned about attack flow so far and put it to work in converting a real cyber threat intelligence report into an attack flow. This is the high-level approach to building the flow that we are going to work through today. The first step is to select your source material. I've already picked out an example report that we can use for this training. Once you've selected CTI reporting to turn into a flow, the next step is to map out the TTPs observed in that intelligence. I'll map everything in MITRE ATT&CK, but attack flow is flexible and you can map your flows to other taxonomies. The third step is to create the action nodes in the flow, which as we discussed in the previous section, those action nodes form the backbone of any flow. And then the fourth and final step is to enrich the flow with context, like indicators of compromise and assets. Now let's take a look at these 4 steps in some more detail. For this training, I'm assuming that you have access to finished intelligence reports, and I'm going to show you how to turn that into a flow. Of course, you can also build a flow from raw intelligence or raw event data, but that process would be a bit different, and that's not really the focus here today. When it comes to selecting which CTI reports to build your flow off of, look for an appropriate level of technical analysis and detail. We have a lengthier explanation of source selection in the Cyber Threat Intelligence Usage Guide on the website. But you need enough detail to determine how the adversary behaved and the sequence of events that transpired. I'm going to use this Fortinet report today as an example. This report is about an info-stealer malware called Formbook and a particular phishing campaign that used that malware. The next step is to annotate TTPs. This step involves identifying what the adversary is doing and why. In our example today, we will use the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base to provide the vocabulary for that adversary behavior. But of course, you're not required to use attack in your own flows. We will briefly talk about how to annotate MITRE ATT&CK TTPs in a report, but a deep dive on the topic is beyond the scope of this training. We could spend several hours going into that, and there are other good presentations out there that cover it. It's probably not possible to memorize all of attack, so a good starting point is to familiarize yourself with the attack tactics first, which is a much more manageable goal. Now, when you approach your CTI report to begin annotating TTPs, it's helpful to start with any overview or executive summary that's available. At this point, you're just trying to get oriented around the intelligence at a high level, the main plot points, which will help you make sense of the details as you read carefully through the body of the report later. In our example report, the overview describes the flow at a high level. The threat actor conducts phishing, the lure exploits a CVE, which then installs the Formbook malware, and then the malware steals data. The next step is to scan the report and highlight relevant snippets. At this point, I'm not annotating attack TTPs yet, just highlighting. Your PDF reader might have a highlighter feature, which is what I am using here. I'm actually using 2 highlighter colors. Blue represents adversary behaviors, while green represents IOCs. Once I've highlighted the entire report, I go back over it a second time and start to fill in the attack TTPs. I recommend you start by identifying the tactic, the why, of the adversary's behavior, and then try to identify the technique, which is the what of their behavior. It is valid to annotate just a tactic without a technique, which you might do either because you can't figure out which technique in attack is most appropriate, or maybe because attack doesn't even contain that technique yet. How do you identify techniques? This is a question we could go down the rabbit hole on, and I want to stay focused on attack flow here, but I will make a few recommendations. One way to do this is to go to attack.mitre.org and use the search feature for keywords mentioned in the report. For example, if the report mentions run DLL32, that's a great keyword for finding a corresponding technique in MITRE ATT&CK. But this approach doesn't work as well when you don't have one of those good, unique keywords. So another approach is to visit the tactic page on the attack website. You can use the find feature in your browser to search the text of this page, which includes all the technique names and some description text. This can be better than searching the entire attack site because it excludes a lot of content that won't be relevant to you. Another option for searching attack is to install the Attack Power Suite browser add-on, which was created by the Center for Threat-Informed Defense to make it easier to work with attack. It has some nice time-saving features like being able to highlight text on a page and search for it in attack, or being able to copy a formatted technique ID and name so that you can paste it into your research notebook. You can download this free and open source browser add-on by going to ctid.io/suite. Finally, it is possible to map attack TTPs using an LLM like ChatGPT or Claude. You need to be careful with this approach since LLMs won't always get the answer right and they are prone to hallucination, which means they might give you the right technique name, but the wrong technique ID, or maybe confidently assert some technique that doesn't even exist. So you should double check the LLM output using one of the search features we were just talking about, but this can be useful to give you a gentle push in the right direction. Okay, at the end of step 2, you have your entire report mapped out to MITRE ATT&CK TTPs. Step 3 is to start building the flow around those observed TTPs. When you create a new flow, you should populate some information such as the author, that is yourself, and supply references. In my example flow, I've added my organization's contact info and a description copied from the CTI report. You should also set the flow scope, which based on the example report we've chosen would be a campaign. The scope setting doesn't change anything in the flow. It's just there so that the reader can tell what the flow represents. And then I also put a link to the source material under the external references section. Now I've labeled the next few slides as 3.1, 3.2, and so on, because I want to emphasize that you don't need to rigidly follow these steps in this order. As an attack flow novice, this is probably a good place to start. But as you get more comfortable with it, you'll find yourself doing some of these steps in parallel, and that's absolutely valid. So anyway, in step 3.1, we start by creating one action node in the flow for each of our mapped TTPs in the report. That is the snippets that we had highlighted earlier. At this point, we're not connecting the actions together. We're just trying to get them all added into the flow. Now in step 3.2, we have all of the actions created, and we can start to move them around on the canvas and wire them together to explain the sequence of actions. And remember, these connections represent adversary actions that depend on each other, not chronological order. Flows can branch out when the adversary has several actions that are independent of each other, and those branches can converge back together later. The final step is to enrich the flow with additional context, such as indicators of compromise, assets, and CVEs. Remember that we said actions are the backbone of the flow, so this step is really about filling in a lot of detail around that backbone. When you're finished with this exercise, you'll have a flow that resembles this one. But keep in mind that everybody's flow will look a little bit different, and in some cases it's good for flows to be different because the author may have been tailoring it to a different audience. Okay, now we've seen the overall process, let's work through the example report together. To get started with our flow, we need to open up the attack flow builder, which as you'll recall, you can reach by going to ctid.io/AFB. And then once we get into the builder, I'll just click create new flow. And then the first thing we need to start doing is filling in the flow properties. So in the background here, I've got my copy of the report open already. This is the copy that I've annotated. So if we scroll down here, we can see these highlights and tactic and technique IDs that I've added. So this is what I'm going to be working off today. Hopefully, if you're following along, you've created a similar PDF of your own. But if you want, you can just grab my copy from the training files that you downloaded. So I'm going to start by just grabbing some of this text here and using this to fill in the name and description. Now, when you copy and paste from the website, usually it pastes pretty well. But copying and pasting from a PDF, you sometimes get these kind of weird, irregular line breaks. And that's okay. I'm not going to bother cleaning all those up today. But in practice, that's something you probably want to do. Next, I'm going to add the author. I'm going to put myself here, but you should add yourself as the author of your flow. The author can specify the identity class, so whether this is a single person or a group of people. I'm going to select individual, and then I'll add my contact information, but adding your contact information is optional, of course. The next thing to fill in is the scope. The scope doesn't actually affect anything about the flow. It just tells your reader what range of activities is included in the flow. And remember, this is a CTI report about a campaign, so I'm just going to select campaign for scope here. And then the last thing I need to do is add my external references. This is where I can cite my source material. So once again, I'm going to just grab this whole title here, and I'm going to use that as my reference name. For description, I'll just say this is a blog post by FortiGuard Labs Research. And then I've got the URL over here that I will just paste in. And so now anyone who opens my flow can see where my source material came from. You can add as many of these references as you want. So if you've got multiple sources, that of course is always a good idea. But in this case, just for the sake of example, we're just going to rely on this one source. Now I'm ready to start adding actions to my flow. I'll start with the first action by right-clicking on the canvas and going to create, and then attack flow, and then action. This will give me a blank action. And now I'm just going to go through my report, and everywhere that I've annotated a MITRE ATT&CK TTP, I'm going to create an action to go along with that. So I'll copy this text here to use as the description. I've already mapped this to the initial access tactic and the spear phishing attachment technique. So over here, we'll go to the action properties. You can actually skip name because it's going to fill that in for you as you select the tactic and technique. So I'll just go straight to tactic. We can see initial access is actually the first one right there. This is enterprise TA0001. Initial access, I'll select that. And then I'll go on to select the technique. One thing I want to point out here about technique selection is that this is showing you all the techniques that are part of that enterprise initial access tactic. If you scroll down here, you'll see this line and these grayed out items. These are basically all the other techniques that are in attack, not just in enterprise, but in mobile and ICS as well. And you can select any of those if you want, but it's essentially saying like, these are the ones that you really want to choose because these are the initial access techniques. Now in this case, I do see the 1566 technique here, but that's the parent technique. And I do want to get that sub technique of 1566.001. And so I'm just going to search for that here. You can see that come up. And then once I select that, you see it does change the name to spear phishing attachment. And then finally, I just want to paste in that description that I had. We can clean this up if we feel like it. And then that's it. That's our first action. So let's go on to the next action now. We've got TA0002 execution, and the technique is malicious file. So I'll just repeat this process. A new action. The tactic is execution. Notice how if I select a tactic without a technique, it sets the name of the action to the tactic name, which is nice. But then if I go in and I decide that I'm also going to map a technique, it will update the name to be the technique name instead. So in this one, I'm 1204.002, malicious file, and I can select that there. And then I'll get this text here like this, and I'll use this for my description. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of these. I'm going to fast forward so you don't have to watch me type each one of these out. Now the next step is to take all these actions we've created and just start to put them into a flow order. Going back to the top of our report, we know that this whole incident starts off with this initial access spear phishing attachment. If in doubt, it is helpful to kind of look for the initial access. That tends to be the first point of a flow just based on the kind of CTI we're used to dealing with. It is possible that you could have some resource development or reconnaissance techniques that actually come before initial access, but in practice, we don't really see those things in CTI. So for the purposes of this flow, we are going to start with that spear phishing attachment. I'm just going to make a little bit of space at the top of the screen so I can drag this over like that. And that's now going to become the start of my flow. We know from the report that the next thing that happens is this malicious file. And so I'm going to drag malicious file up here as well. And I'm going to wire that in. Remember, as we're going here, we are trying to put these in the order of dependencies, not necessarily the order things happened in. As it turns out, this flow is pretty linear throughout the beginning part here, so we'll just keep stepping through this. The next technique is this embedded payloads and this binary padding. These two are both affecting this initial payload, so I'm going to put these in order as well. I notice here I'm starting to get stuff kind of stacked up on top of each other. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to use my rectangle tool. I'm holding down Alt or Option if you're on a Mac keyboard. I'm just going to take all of this stuff and just kind of drag it out of the way to make some more space. And this will give me some more room to work up here. Now going back to my report, I've got the other embedded payload. This is the one with the Algeria RTF document that's going to come next. And then that document is ultimately what exploits the CVE. So I'm going to go grab those two next and put those into order like this. And then back to the report. The next thing that happens is that payload runs. It uses Windows command shell. So we'll put that in next. And then that payload is using this run DLL defensive agent as part of its execution. So we'll go ahead and get that as well, and we'll drag these into the flow and wire them up like this. I'm going to just keep moving things out of the way. There we go. Now this is where things start to get interesting. We'll take a look at our report again here, and we see the next thing that it goes over is this persistence technique. And then after that persistence technique, it also has this form book payload that starts to run. It uses some masquerading, another ingress. And so the persistence mechanism here and this payload execution are actually independent of each other. That is, the adversary doesn't need the persistence mechanism to succeed in order to run the payload, and vice versa. So this is actually a spot where we are going to have the flow branch out. So one branch is going to go this way to this persistence technique. And then over here, we're going to have this malware execution. Let's take a look at the report again. So we've got this masquerading, and then the command and control, and then this defense evasion. So I'm just going to grab those and put those. Let's see, which order was this ingress? This was in the middle here. And then this encoded file, this defense evasion, and then finally this process hollowing. And then the implant has a host zombie process that it can actually run inside of. So I'll wire these all up, and this is what this other branch of the flow looks like. And then we'll take a look at our report, and I think we're done here. That is actually everything that's in this report. The report does talk a little bit about how the malware works, but not really at a behavioral level. It's really at a technical level. And then they do have a follow-up. There's a part 2 to this where they really run into what impacts the malware has. But we'll not include that in our flow here today because we are trying to keep this kind of short and sweet. And so this is what our final flow looks like. If you've been following along, again, it's okay if your flow looks a little bit different, especially as we're tailoring to different audiences. Everyone's outcome will be a little bit different. But in general, this is basically what the flow should look like at the end of this step. In the next step, we're going to move on to adding context. But at this point, if you have been following along, that's great. If not, you can find this copy of the flow in the supplementary files available with the slides. Now we're on to the 4th step of our 4-step process, which is to enrich this flow. So we've got the backbone with all the actions in it. And now we want to add context like sticks, items, and assets, and what have you. So when I was going through the report earlier, one of the things I did to save time is I went ahead and just marked up in green everything that I thought would be a good indicator to include in my flow. So if we come down here, we can see, for example, order 0087.docx is an indicator. So in my flow over here, I'm going to come to create, and this time I'm going to go to sticks observable and choose file. And I want to add a file here to my flow. And I just want to name it the same thing as in the CTI, which is order 0087.docx. And then we can just wire this up to the flow like this. Now, if there's any other information about this file that we have, we could go ahead and add it in here. And in fact, in the appendix of this report, they do have file hashes. So I'll show you how to add that in now. Here are the file hashes. So we've got SHA-256 here. So I'm just going to take this one for order 0087. And then in the properties here, you'll see there's hashes in the properties panel. I'll click add there and then click the arrow to open it up. First of all, you need to select the hash type so that it knows which hash algorithm you're using. This is a SHA-2 according to the report here. And then I'll just paste in that value. One of the things that's really nice about working with attack flow is that it's validating everything you're doing, and that includes validating your sticks data as well. So for example, if I put an invalid hash here, like if I paste it in MD5 instead of a SHA-2, it will show me down here in the problem section that you've got an invalid hash value. And then once again, if you click on any problem here, it will zoom you straight to that item in your canvas, and then it's really easy to see, oh, okay, this is the hash value that's invalid, and you can go and fix it. So we've got it like that. Now, The next action actually refers to the same file, so I'm going to go ahead and connect this as well. And now this is showing that these two actions actually relate to this file. So if you're doing any kind of detections or threat hunting, and you want to kind of combine the behavioral component along with these IOCs, the flow makes it really easy to see kind of where the IOCs fit in. Let's move on to the next file, which is this Algeria RTF. I'm just going to copy this SHA-2 hash. And the Algeria RTF file is mentioned down here. So I'll create another STIX observable. This file is called Algeria RTF. I have one hash for it, which is a SHA-2, like this. And then I can wire this into the flow. And actually, this action right above it, this one's also referring to Algeria RTF. So I'll go ahead and attach that one to the file as well. Again, just really clearly indicating that these two actions are operating on this same entity, the same file with this known hash. Now I'm going to go and get the next hash, which is this one, this Adobe ID.pdf, which is used somewhere down here. Here it is in this run DLL 32 action. We see the Adobe ID PDF file there. So I'll create this STIX object and put in the file name and add that hash we've got. And then wire that into my flow. And then there's one more hash here, which is this PNG file. If it'll let me select this, here we go. And in this case, we know the PNG is downloaded, but we don't actually have a path for it here. So in this case, I'm going to create that STIX file and leave the name blank, and then add the hash. And now I can just wire this kind of anonymous file into my flow, just like that. Now we've got a few other indicators here. One of them is the URL for the ingress tool transfer. So if we go back to that section, we have this URL right here. And we can use that to annotate this ingress tool transfer action. And again, this is going to be under STIX observable, but this time we'll go to the URL object instead of the file object. And then this one's really simple. You just paste in the actual URL like this. Attack flow never makes links clickable. So if you wanted to rearm this URL, that would be totally safe to do here. This doesn't actually ever get called out to or anything like that. Now we can wire that up into our flow as well. And then there's just a couple more things I'd like to add here. One is the CVE object. So we know that there was a CVE that was exploited right here, CVE 2017-1182. So I'd like to go ahead and capture that as structured data. So I can come here and go to create STIX object vulnerability. And this allows me to put in the CVE name. And I can go to the National Vulnerability Database and get a description for this later, but for now, this will be good enough. I'll just put this in the way it is. The last indicator I want is the file path of this final payload that runs, which we will find right here. The variant of Formbook uses this target process right here for process hollowing, and so I do want to capture that in my flow as well. So we'll go down to the process hollowing action, and I want to create a new file object here and just put that whole path there, just because that's a really nice indicator to use here, and then wire that into my flow as well. And then at this point, the flow is pretty much done. This is looking really good. This is using all of the items I annotated. There's one more thing I'm going to do here, just because remember, at the end of this report, this is part one, and we know that this part has not gone into all of the capabilities of the malware, and that's kind of what they get into in part two. So I'm just going to add a note here This is helpful when you are creating preliminary intelligence and you want to come back later and kind of talk about what you saw. So I might just say here, to do, and then read part 2 of the report to understand how the malware works and what its capabilities are. And then that's basically it. So now that your flow is done, you can just go to File and Save, and this will save it off in attack flow format for us. Actually, I noticed right as I was doing that I have this error here that I should fix before I save this. A note must point to at least one object. I actually got the arrow backwards here. Instead of pointing from the action to the note, this should actually point from the note to the action. So that's fine. That'll fix that error. And then I'll just go ahead and save it again. You'll also notice that by fixing all the errors, now I've given myself this export sticks option, which isn't available if your flow has any errors in it. So by fixing the errors, now I can save this as a sticks bundle in JSON format. So I'll go ahead and save that off as well right now. This brings us to the end of section 3, where we learned how to build an attack flow from scratch. Congratulations, this was the steepest learning curve, and you're now equipped to start using attack flow for your real work. The next section will shift focus a bit to what kinds of things we can do with the flow after we've built it, and in particular, we will dive into the topic of flow visualization. Visit our Get Involved page to learn how organizations and individuals alike can work together to advance our common goal of expanding threat-informed defense. And follow us on LinkedIn for future updates on attack flow and other major projects such as Mapping Explorer and Summiting the Pyramid.